Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Mysteries and Disappearances video. While I'm waiting for more of your suggestions to come through, I thought I would mix this one in here. This one is just a random one, some that I found in a website that showcases disappearances from before the 1900s. I do favor some of the older ones because there's always the notion that no matter how old that disappearance is, in this case 100 years plus, there's always the chance, the hope that something will be found, that there'll be some kind of answer giving finally after all this time with regards to that person's disappearance. Such is the case with this gentleman here who was a cyclist who actually attempted to travel across the world on just a bicycle, and during that attempt he ended up disappearing forever. In fact, you're looking at a picture of him here. His name was Lenz, and so let's go ahead and let's talk about that here, the disappearance of the cyclist Lenz. I'll try to present as much information as possible and then give my own thoughts and opinions on it as well. So for starters, who was Lenz? Well, he was someone that was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania back in 1867 to some parents named Adam Reinhardt and Anna Maria Reinhardt. They were both immigrants from Germany, and then he in turn just basically grew up here in the United States. His father, though, ended up dying when he was really young, and then somewhere afterward they ended up moving over to Pittsburgh. But it was at a young age as well, in fact 17, that Frank decided to take up cycling. This was his passion. This was something that he wanted to just basically do his entire life. So he joined the club called the Allegheny Cycle Club, and in that case that was his starting point, looking at some of the back roads there in Pennsylvania and growing from there. Eventually it grew into longer and longer trips, riding from Pennsylvania to New York City, St. Louis, New Orleans, Chicago. What was interesting is that he was a photographer as well, and so he would bring his camera with him, and that way anywhere he traveled in his bicycle, then he was able to take pictures along the way. I always find bicycling, like cyclists, fascinating because I enjoy riding a bicycle, but it's just for fun. These people, though, take it to a whole other level. To them, it's about going very far distances, which to me, I can just imagine like how gruesome that would be. Like for me, just riding a couple of miles is enough, but here in this case we're talking about hundreds of miles, and in some cases even thousands. So I'll talk about more here in a minute, but they're doing it. They love it. They have that passion. It does not tire them out, and so more power to them. So this is definitely, absolutely was the career of Lenz. He eventually decided, after there was another cyclist by the name of Thomas Stevens who completed his first trip around the globe. It's known as circumnavigation. It's using a bicycle essentially to travel the whole world. Obviously, in points of water, you go by ship, but then once you get to a point of land, then that's when you go on the bicycle again. So he was inspired by that cyclist, and he decided to do his own attempt. And so lo and behold, there he was, essentially going out. He was going to do this, in fact, on May 15th, 1892. And then he had not just 100, 200, but 800 onlookers who were there essentially to set him out. And this was somewhere near a place called the Smithfield Street Bridge there in Pittsburgh. So those of you that live in Pittsburgh, if you have an idea of where the Smithfield Street Bridge is, next time you pass by, just know that Lenz ended up going from his doomed trip, starting it from that location specifically. And travel he did. He went to Washington, D.C., he went to New York, he went to Canada. He eventually went all the way to San Francisco and got there by October 20th. So again, he started in May, and then he ended up finishing there in October. But then he utilized a boat to travel over to Japan, and eventually he crossed over to China. And throughout the way, he was able to have some positive and negative experiences too. China, he had a lot of fun in Japan, but China was a location that apparently the roads were brutal, especially when it came to the winter time there. Along the way too, he also went across some locals, and they weren't exactly too kind to him. That's another thing that I was thinking of when I was originally reading this information. You gotta wonder how some locals will take things. All of a sudden they see this stranger, somebody that's obviously from another country, riding a bicycle, just trying to pass through. All of a sudden, you always have like some kind of notion in your head. You're thinking, what is this? And then you're thinking, is there any danger at the same time? But it took him, instead of 3 months, 6 months to cross China because of that situation. But there he was. Imagine that. As big as China is, he actually was able to cross it. And so it just, again, shows the dedication. He reached Burma. Burma was even more brutal because of the heavy rain and the roads that were there. On top of that, he ended up getting malaria for that cycling that was there. And then eventually he reached another location that eventually took him to the Ottoman capital of Istanbul. Or actually, he wanted to reach that area before summertime because that's when it was going to get brutally hot. And so by this point, it was May 1894. This was almost 2 years after he originally set off from Pittsburgh. And then he was going to go to an area called Erzurum, or at least it was called that, at least at that time. Well, actually, I say at that time because it was originally known as the Ottoman Empire, but it's now Turkey. So that was his fateful location, which was essentially the last point he was ever seen. It turns out during that time period in May 1894 that something occurred. To this day, it's still mysterious as to what happened to him, but after some analysis and some investigation was done, in fact, it was a little about, was it 2 months or so after that happened that nobody had heard from him, that his family started to worry. This was going towards the summertime, that they realized that something might have happened. And so there was a group that was set out from a magazine called Outing, including another famous bicyclist, a guy by the name of William Cyclist, and they in turn decided to investigate what occurred. So this cyclist, William Cyclist, traveled all the way over to that last known spot, sailed over to Europe, traveled to Erzurum to try to see what he could do. In fact, he actually had to forge papers to try to get in to that location. And it turns out, and it's still not 100% quite sure, but here's what he was able to discern. It turns out it all came down to one single insult. At one point, Frank Lenz was traveling through some area. This was apparently an area that was filled with some Kurdish people. Well, they had a leader there, and somewhere along the way, this Kurdish chief was insulted by Frank. There's not 100% sureness on this, though, because again, this is coming from people that William, I guess, was talking to, and so they're from third parties. But yeah, Frank was apparently passing through the small village, and remember I was mentioning earlier how there's bound to be some fraud, like some people that are not necessarily, some locals that are not necessarily too kind to seeing all of a sudden a stranger in a bicycle, of all things, coming by. Well, either way, though, something must have occurred, and Frank insulted that local Kurdish chief. And so when that occurred, some of the other Kurds there apparently ambushed him. They ambushed him, they killed him, and then they buried his body there on the bank of a river somewhere, completely anonymous. Who knows where it was, if it even happened, on a river by some forest. And so that's essentially what occurred, if you believe it, to Frank Lenz. He ended up passing by throughout most of the world itself, and then all it took is passing by this small village and having that small insult given, and then that was it. He was killed at that point and then buried somewhere. Who knows if his body will ever be found? Who knows if that even occurred there, if he was actually killed somewhere else. But either way, though, there was some eventual people that were convicted for it. They were charged, but they were able to escape. Apparently, some of them ended up dying in prison as well. And then afterward, it took about 8 years, but the Ottoman government there finally decided, from pressure from the U.S. no less, to actually give a amount, $7,500, to Frank Lenz's mother, I guess in recognition of what occurred, which again inclines towards that truthfulness of that story about the insult and about the bandits and about the Kurdish chief and so on. So that's pretty much it. So technically, there is no, again, 100% surety as to what occurred to him. No official cause of death, but unofficially, there's the idea that he was basically murdered. And because of that situation and his body never ever been found, it's still considered a mysterious disappearance to this day. But let me know what you guys and gals think of with regards to this very unique story. Again, this was a guy that decided to seek out his passion. He decided to do this in terms of traveling across the world, in terms of taking that bike and going through the circumnavigation of the globe. But somewhere along the way, he just finally met something that ended up causing his demise, if one believes that story. But let me know again what you guys and gals think. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.